This has never happened before. In the history of ride sharing, this has never happened. I'm not exaggerating when I say this is the biggest news story yet about ride sharing with Lyft and Uber and every single Uber driver and Lyft driver out there. This is going to change the game. Whether it's for better or for worse, I genuinely don't know, but this is massive. And that is that Uber and Lyft are both leaving Minneapolis due to the minimum wage law, which takes effect on May 1st. This is a way bigger deal than you might think, and you might be thinking for a lot of people out there, like, Mark, I'm not in Minneapolis. Why do I care? You should. I cannot, understate or overstate or whatever the right phrasing is, how big of a deal this is. It's happening. And I gotta stress this. I've said it before and I'll say it again, that when something happens in a different part of the country with Lyft and Uber, the ripple effect gets heard everywhere, right? And this has never happened. It's been proposed numerous times in different areas that when something takes place, like a law, something like this happening, a new legislation, etc., Lyft and Uber's main stance usually is, oh, well, we're going to leave. It's kind of annoying, right? They're almost acting like toddlers. Hate to say it, sorry, Lyft and Uber. I'm very honest about the pros and the cons, and I'm very transparent about Lyft and Uber. They've done a lot of amazing things. But also, sometimes they act like toddlers, being like, oh, you know what? I don't like what you guys are doing. I'm going to leave. And now that's happening. Uber and Lyft said they will stop operating in Minneapolis after the city council voted to overrule the mayor's veto of a minimum wage law impacting rideshare drivers. Now, this is something I talked about, was it like a week or 2 weeks ago? Basically saying, yeah, this is something that's being put forward. What would happen if it actually got put forward? And it actually happened. And it did. So now, on April 1st, May 1st, sorry about that. On May 1st, Uber and Lyft is officially leaving. This has never happened before. And I have to stress, for a lot of reasons I'm going to cover in this video, from logistical reasons, accounting reasons, maybe even legal stuff going on in different areas. Like, there's a lot going on here. And going on here, Lyft and Uber said it's shutting down its operations in Minneapolis when the law takes effect on May 1st. So, at least at the exact time of this video, it's March 15th. There's basically, a month and a half left of Ubers and Lyfts taking place in Minneapolis. And remember, this is a two-way street, which is really, really bad. Both for drivers, if you drive for Lyft and Uber in Minneapolis, you're going to have to find another job. In a month and a half, you're done, right? I don't know what are you going to do. And then for people taking Ubers and Lyfts in Minneapolis, you're done. Uber said it will also stop operating its transportation network in the entire metro. I have no idea what that was. Oh, some ad. I was like, am I getting a call on my computer? That was really weird. Anyway, I don't think that just threw me off. Anyway, Uber said it would stop operating its transportation network in the entire metro area, including the airport, that same day. Thinking about that too, I didn't even think about this actually until seeing that one, the last blurb, because I scanned through this article decently quick before doing this video. I mean, if let's say you fly into Minneapolis and it's May 2nd and you're like, all right, let me get Lyft and Uber from the airport, and it's like, wait, there's no Lyfts, there's no Ubers. That's what I didn't even think about just in that blurb, right? The ordinance, which is now being put forward and is happening, faced fierce pushback from the ride-sharing industry, as typically all this kind of stuff does, and establishes a minimum driver pay of $1.40 per mile and 51 cents per minute, or a minimum of $5 per trip. I think that's very reasonable. I mean, I feel like that's pretty low, but, whichever is greater. The city council's goal over the past 18 months has been to ensure that driver rates are equivalent to the local minimum wage, which rose to $15.57 per hour in January. And they basically vetoed and overrided the mayor's veto when it comes to this ordinance being put forward. And here's what's interesting to me, and I'm talking about this, throughout this video in numerous different ways. There's a lot of moving parts to this. I cannot stress, like I've said, and you can probably tell, that not in a clickbaity YouTube, like, oh my God, look what's happening way, but genuinely this is huge. Because if you look at places like California and New York, there was some pushback with Lyft and Uber, but not like this. This is the first time in history where Lyft and Uber is actually leaving an area, and I genuinely don't know how this is going to be put forward, because they use this excuse. I don't know if it's an excuse or an argument, whatever you want to use, whatever word you want to use, of them potentially leaving an area. And this is the first time they're actually doing it. This is the first time we're going to see how is this actually going to impact the entire economy of that area. And you could argue and look at, well, okay, this happened in New York. This happened in California. California has a minimum hourly wage. Same thing with New York. So it's weird that in California and New York, which I will say I do understand are two very different states compared to most states, right? California and New York are the two biggest rideshare hubs of the country. No question there, right? But this is more of a smaller one, more of like, I'd say, how do I word this? I think this is more indicative of what you could say is the average economy for ride sharing. This is really interesting. I've talked before about putting forward a minimum wage, minimum hourly guarantee. I don't know, this is tough, right? Anyway, the city council will not let communities be exploited for cheap labor. That is the biggest thing, right? That drivers are human beings with families and they deserve dignified minimum wages like all other workers. I can't believe that that's even something that has to be said. Like, that should goes without saying. I've done a bajillion videos on this channel. I don't like being clickbaity. I don't like YouTubers who all they do is rant and it's a waste of your time. But it is tough because on the other end, I'm like, Lyft and Uber is doing a lot of horrible things. It is the worst time in human history to be a rideshare driver. There's no question. Like I said, I look at it as the triple threat. It costs more money now because of inflation, like gas prices, maintenance on your car, just general expenses. It costs more money now to be a rideshare driver. Lyft and Uber's taking out a bigger cut than ever before, and you're making, in addition, less money than ever before, even ignoring those other two things. That, before, when I first started driving, the average amount I would make, just in general, is 20 to 25 an hour. Back in, 2015, that was pretty good, 20 to 25 an hour. Now, it's almost the same exact amount, but that dollar, of course, is not stretching as far. And even in other situations, going a little bit back up, in this article, where is it? Or was it down here? I think they said that the average amount that the driver makes, I'm going to skip down and skip back up. Where is it? I know it's around here somewhere. I think it was here it is. Okay. The average amount a driver makes in Minneapolis and St. Paul is $13.63. That's way less than the 20 to 25 an hour I was making in Boston back in the day. If anything, that should be way higher now, given the fact that, that was almost a decade ago, right, when I started driving. And so that is a huge thing. It's kind of ridiculous, right? I skipped over this actually super quick. But yeah, the median earnings, as you can see for drivers, is $13.63. I can't believe, going back to the statement that that has to be something that has to be like an argument. Of course, drivers should get paid what they should be getting paid in terms of an effective way to be able to just live in general, right? And I know some people argue, well, Mark, you're meant to live off your Uber and Lyft earnings. That could be a debate for a whole other video. I think that you should at least get minimum wage, especially given all the expenses you have to inevitably incur as a driver. Now, critics of the bill argue, which could be true, and I think it might be, right, that it would boost ride prices and force consumers to stop using the service. Now, that is, I think, a valid argument. I think it's always important to look at both sides. And this ordinance would make rides unaffordable for the majority of Minneapolis residents, Lyft said. The drastic drop in rides mean the thousands of drivers who rely on Lyft for earnings would ultimately make less, creating an unstable situation for our customers. This is what's really interesting, because when I talked before about the minimum hourly guarantee being a federal thing, for example, for rideshare drivers, in New York and California, it works. But granted, like I said, those are very different areas. And this could be maybe more indicative, for better or for worse, of what it would be like in an average state, in an average economy, that maybe Uber and Lyft, and I don't know what the accounting looks like on the back end, maybe only Uber and Lyft does. And I would love, especially for me being a former accountant, to see kind of the nitty-gritty numbers. But maybe they're realizing, there's just not as many rides in Minneapolis compared to Los Angeles. We can do a minimum hourly guarantee because of how popular Lyft and Uber is in LA. Or San Francisco, of course, being the rideshare hub of the world. Or New York City. But in a place like Minneapolis, it's just not as, nonstop as it is compared to pretty much the two big major cities of the country, LA and New York. And then San Francisco might as well include it with that. So maybe this is why they're saying, hey, it's just not going to work. And Lyft told Fox Business, that it supports the minimum earning standard, but that this ordinance is deeply flawed and has been jammed through despite major concerns being raised by the community. Community meaning ride sharing, and it's tricky because even David Reischer, said something. I said that earlier this month. He said he believes central governments should stay out of the price-setting game. That's also I don't say it's a subtle statement, but that's also another big question, right? If you look at what happened here in California with Prop 22, after AB 5 got passed and Prop 22 was a special clause just for ride sharing, should that be the case or not? This is so tricky, and there's so much to this, right? Because I genuinely don't know what's going to happen on May 1st, Lyft said it will still advocate for a statewide solution in Minnesota that balances the needs of riders and drivers, because remember, it's a two-way street, I guess pun intended, and hopes to return to Minneapolis as soon as possible. Lyft told Fox Business that the move is putting roughly about 10,000 people out of work and leaving many stranded, but we know by working together with all stakeholders, drivers, riders, and state leaders, we can achieve the comprehensive statewide legislation that guarantees drivers a fair minimum wage, protects their independence, and keeps rideshare affordable. I gotta say, I have no idea what's going to happen on May 1st. And this is, like I said, like 5 or 6 times throughout this video, this is big. Because this is the first time, I think there's a bunch of moving parts I'm very interested in. And looking at kind of from afar, being like, oh my God, look what's going on down there. Because one is, this is the first time I've seen, as far as I know of, a minimum wage actually happening in an area that's not a major city. Of course, like I said, the economies and the accounting behind New York City and LA and San Francisco, for example, are very different than, like, say, your average city, right? I think that is something that has to be taken into an account. Maybe when I brought up the whole fact of drivers being independent contractors, but yet still having benefits like minimum wage, maybe that makes sense and will work in places like New York and LA, and it is, right? That's what's happening right now. But in, like, say, your average city, it wouldn't work, maybe for much of reasons. Maybe if you think about it, in LA and New York and San Francisco, you get rides like that. It's nonstop when it comes to getting rides. And so Lyft and Uber says, well, drivers get so many rides anyway, it's almost inevitable they would get the minimum wage. But maybe in a place like Minnesota, they're like, I don't know. Like, maybe in a place like this, they're like, you know what, they might get one ride an hour if there's too many drivers on the road, which I've talked about before in other videos. In this year, there's never been more drivers on the road in human history. And yes, there's never been more people taking and ordering Ubers and Lyfts in human history. However, the trajectory of the growth of drivers versus the growth of passengers, very opposite, and it's a higher increase in the rate of people driving. So maybe they say, look, numerous drivers can get on the road, they wouldn't get any rides at all, but we still have to pay a minimum wage, and the only way for us to do this out of our own pockets and to compensate them for the minimum wage is charging customers more. And then this becomes this kind of odd, kind of double-edged sword where, because we're doing that, not only are drivers now not getting rides, but consumers are paying more. And when consumers pay more, they're like, okay, it's a $30 Uber. I'm just going to drive to the event. I was going to maybe have some drinks. Now I just won't drink. And instead, I'm just going to drive. And there's less rides now for the drivers. And then they're not making that much, but Uber Lyft still has to pay them, right? Could there be something where maybe, like, we're in a special clause, and I'm making this up, and I've said this before in other videos, where you have to, if there's too many drivers on the road and you go to sign on, you can't, but then that removes the quote-unquote instantaneous flexibility of being an Uber driver and a Lyft driver. It is really tough to say. And this is why there's so many moving parts. Is that, one, like I said, I don't know what's going to happen once it happens on May 1st. So the second big thing, I think, when it comes to all this, and this is what I'm really worried about, is the impact it's going to have on Minneapolis, that area of Minnesota, because this has never happened where Uber Lyft was in an area. It was a widely used commodity. I don't know if I call it a commodity. I look at it as a necessity, Definitely a necessity, and now they're removing it, right? I've said this before, that Uber and Lyft, I'm going to minimize this, sorry. There's like another ad playing, I can see it. Anyway, but Uber and Lyft before, or should be Uber and Lyft in general, right? I look at as a huge necessity on two ends. Like Uber said, roughly about 10,000 people now will be out of jobs starting on May 1st. On the other end, not only that, but people are going to be left stranded, right? One quick example that I didn't even think about until I saw that one minor but small but important point in the article is airports. Like, say you fly into Minneapolis, you're on a work trip, you're going on a vacation, you're visiting France, whatever the case is, right? You now can't get a Lyft and Uber from the airport. Now, yes, there's taxis. Yes, there might be buses. I've never gone to Minneapolis, so I can't say exactly. But that's one now huge transportation element of the airport that's removed to and from the airport. Then you bring up this whole aspect of price gouging with taxis, right? There's a reason, I hate to say it, and again, I've done some videos about taxis versus Lyft and Uber. I think it's gone back and forth. I look at it very comparable, side by side with hotels versus Airbnbs, pros and cons of both sides. But I remember the big thing that Uber and Lyft really solved, I mean, among a lot of different problems that Uber and Lyft solved, was price gouging by taxis. I don't know, it's kind of interesting because if you talk to a lot of people, like say Gen Z, for example, millennials kind of remember this, especially, and then if you look back and almost everyone remembers this, that you had to almost do this weird thing getting into a taxi of pretending like you're from the area, or you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to this one street, you know, I used to grow up here, and it actually used to be a thing that you almost kind of knew the taxi driver would purposely take you on a circuitous route to get more money out of you. This was something everyone knew, and it kind of sucks that, like, you knew you were getting duped. You knew that you were getting screwed over, but that was just part of taking a taxi. You're like, yeah, you know, and I remember so many times in Boston, I knew people that would take a taxi, and this happened to me. I took a taxi, and the driver, I could tell, was purposely taking the long route because maybe they thought I wasn't from there, or maybe they thought I was visiting. And I'm like, hey, I'm from here. Don't do this. And then the taxi driver's like, oh, I'm sorry. And I'm like, we both know what's happening. We both know what's going on. They're just trying to make more money. And Lyft and Uber saw that. We said, hey, with GPSs now being on everyone's phone, right, which is a huge thing, and everything, now you can see exactly where you're going. There's no hidden being screwed over. And I think that's the thing that Gen Z probably doesn't even know about, like the future generations might even not know that was a huge thing, right? So now take this situation, it lets you fly into Minneapolis. Is that going to be the same situation? Now, granted, I think one huge element of getting, this is a bit of a side note, but getting screwed over by taxis, I think one huge element of that was the whole GPS situation. Now you can actually track, like, wait, I can see on Google Maps you're going the wrong way. Anyway, though, I digress. Take and ignore even now the airport situation, just getting around. If you're elderly or disabled or handicapped, if you don't have a car, if you use Lyft and Uber to get to and from work because you need to, if, let's say, you want to go out on a Friday and Saturday night and you're going out drinking and it would be safe and, of course, responsible, you take Ubers and Lyfts, all that's gone now. And it's super, super, super difficult, I think, right now to see what's going to happen, because this is going to be a double whammy to both people driving for Uber and Lyft and people ordering and taking Ubers and Lyfts. I have no idea what's going to happen, and I hate to say it, I am kind of curious to see what's going to happen on May 1st, just because this, I think, is going to be a big sign of what could happen for the rest of the country for two different reasons. One, having a minimum wage or a minimum hourly guarantee. I've said it before that I do think it should be a federal thing. But also you bring up a couple of interesting questions. One, can that even work? Is it possible that can't work? Now, granted, in this situation, you could look at it in two different ways. On one end, you could say, look, maybe Uber and Lyft's right. Maybe a minimum wage in an average city or a typical city just doesn't work. In a place like LA and New York, it can, given how many people live here, how many rides are happening. But in your average city, it just does not work. Maybe that is true. On the other hand, maybe Uber and Lyft saying, it could work, but we just don't want to spend that much money. Or it could be a combination. Maybe it is really difficult, but they can make it work, but they just decide not to. Then you have to look at what David Reisher said, the CEO, which is a very interesting statement that the government or federal entities, let's call it that, should stay out of the ride-sharing aspect when it comes to pricing. Should that be true or not? Now, I honestly don't know, because you could say, hey, Lyft and Uber are businesses, that's kind of what it is. They're not really tied, in a sense, to any federal government. So, yeah, in a sense, they're companies. They can do what they want. At the same time, I hate to say it, whether you like it or not, and like I've said, throughout this video a few times, I do look at ride-sharing as a necessity. I look at it as something that is ultra important to our society. And I think it's at the level now with it being, in my opinion, a necessity. I look at rideshare drivers as essential workers. With it being that level of importance, I look at it now as something that maybe the government inevitably kind of has to be involved with. I mean, imagine what would happen tomorrow, for example, if Uber Lyft went away forever. Not just in Minneapolis, but everywhere. I mean, that would have a huge impact. I mean, whether it's small things like getting to and from the bar, you could look at it as like other things. Like our world has now changed for better or for worse. You could argue, I think, for better. But our world's now changed as a result of Lyft and Uber being here, being in existence. And then when you take that away, I don't know. And that's when things get super, super tricky, right? And that brings back to this interesting point that, one, when it comes to minimum wage, this is the first time that really that's been put forward where maybe it is not going to work. And for what it seems like, it isn't going to work. Maybe that's indicative that maybe a minimum wage will never exist for rideshare drivers. I don't know. This is why this could have a huge effect, because when something happens in, like, say, California and New York, I do think it has a ripple effect around the country, because other states say, it'll work for them. Why not work for us? But maybe for the average place, it wouldn't. Maybe it's a sign that a federal minimum wage, for example, for rideshare drivers will never exist ever, which in my opinion makes it even less worth it to drive. And throughout the years, you may have noticed, or months, for example, for those following this channel, that I've gotten more and more pessimistic about being a rideshare driver just because I don't think it's worth it anymore. Maybe this is a sign for that, right? That could be very true, right? So one, the federal minimum wage, maybe that won't be a thing. And I've pushed for that. I've talked about that and pushed that forward on a lot of videos, because that to me is, I look at it, and I hate to use this phrase because I see this a lot on TikTok. I look at it as the bare minimum, right? Like, that should be the bare minimum for rideshare drivers to at least get, I mean, look at the situation. The average driver in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, was like, what, $13-ish, give or take. They raised the minimum wage in the state in general to what, $15? It's an extra $2 an hour. And I do understand that extrapolated to all the drivers out there and everything. Yes, I do understand that seems like only $2 an hour, but it increases and blah, blah, blah. But that should be the bare minimum, right? Now, the second big thing, though, about this, which to me is also, this is why I'm going so in-depth on this video and really kind of hitting a lot of different points. This is why I'm so invested in this story, is this is also the first time that a laws got put forward, or legislation, not just with minimum wage, but in general, involving something with Uber and Lyft that they did not like. And this is the first time that not only has Uber and Lyft said, oh, we're gonna leave if you guys do this. Like screw you guys. They've said that before in a bunch of ways. I hate to say, I think it's childish. I get that maybe they do have a point, and that could be true. Maybe they do have a point that they're like, hey, it's just not gonna work. It's not about us trying to make more money or be these, capitalistic companies. It just would not work based off the accounting. And that could genuinely be true. Or maybe it's a combination of both. Maybe they could make it work, but it's so much of a stranglehold financially that's not going to be good. But this is the first time that something's happened that Uber and Lyft did not like, that Uber and Lyft said, you know what? We told you. The city thought maybe they were bluffing, and they're not, and now they're actually leaving. And what is that going to look like? That is going to be very interesting, because now, and this is why I'm kind of worried, to be honest, is now, one, in the future, like say if something, I'm to pick a random city, I don't know, take Oklahoma City. I don't know why they probably had. By the way, a little fun side note, that was my first time as an electronic musician and as a DJ. It was my first ever festival I ever performed at was in Oklahoma City. Cool fun fact. I don't know. Maybe that's why it popped into my head. Anyway, take like Oklahoma City. And let's say something happens in Oklahoma City and they're like, hey, you know what? We want to change the rules and laws and legislation for rideshare drivers, like a minimum hourly guarantee or benefits or just something to make it better. And Lyft Uber says, hey, see what happened in Minneapolis? That could happen to you. We're not messing around. This, I feel like, could make Uber and Lyft, I hate to say it, have a bit more power to say like, hey, like we did it before, we'll do it again, right? This is the first time that they're doing this, and granted, who knows? Maybe in the next month and a half, something will happen, and I kind of hope it does. I honestly don't know. Maybe something will happen where they say, okay, you know what? We know we're actually putting this forward. We know we're actually putting this forward. We have a month and a half to figure this out. Let's sit down at a table, work this out before May 1st, because this is going to have a drastic impact. So maybe this is all speculation, but I doubt it. I mean, we know how slow anything in the legal world moves. I don't know, right? But like I said, this is something that now Lyft and Uber, I feel like if they do actually pull out, which they are, I mean, they clearly said they are, this is the first time that they can actually look at this and say, yeah, we did it before, we'll do it again, which is so annoying to me. There's no other way to word that. It's annoying and frustrating because that gives Lyft and Uber more power. And then you could argue, going back to David Reesher's statement, should the federal government be able to get involved? I mean, I hate to say it. I think, I don't know, that's a touchy subject. It is tough to say that should government entities or legal entities get involved with how much ride sharing costs, how much they're paying their drivers, etc. It is tough because on one end, I'm like, hey, leave it to Lyft and Uber. I kind of understand that argument. On the other end, I'm like, hey, we all know drivers are being taken advantage of, and a lot of drivers have commented on this channel saying, hey, we're being treated like slaves. You know, granted, you could argue a lot of an elements that technically no one forced you to be an Uber Lyft driver. No one said, hey, for the next 5 years, you have to be a driver whether you like it or not. You chose to do it. You could always go and get another job. But then you argue, well, Lyft and Uber, again, there's a lot of different ways you can argue this. So this is kind of like opening up Pandora's box, but that's why I'm so invested in this story. This has never happened before, like I said in the intro of this video. And I'm not exaggerating when I say, without any hyperbole or exaggeration or any kind of YouTube-y clickbaity stuff, that this, I think, is going to be very interesting to observe. I hate to say it, that this mess that could potentially exist and probably will exist unless something happens is going to change the ride-sharing world forever, because now in any other average city, and if you think about it, New York, LA, San Francisco, only 3 cities, right? If this happened in Miami or Chicago, which are not as popular as LA and New York, but still very big cities, would the same thing happen, right? But now Lyft and Uber, I think, has the power, and I think the example to say, hey, we've done it before, we'll do it again. Sorry, but we'll do it again. And I think that's bad. Which then now leads me to this last point, which is another very interesting one, is will they come back? Now, granted, that was kind of the last point of the article. Could it be that maybe after May 1st, or after that first week, let's say May 1st or May 7th or 8th, it's a sugar honey iced tea show. It's a mess. And it's hit the fan. And people can order Ubers and Lyfts, of course. You have to rely on taxis now or the public transportation system. Like I said, I've never been to Minneapolis, so I don't know if it's good or not. By the way, I think as a side note, I think there's only, 6 or 7 states I've not been to in the country. And I think Minnesota is one of them. I think it's like North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Alaska, Hawaii, I think Arkansas. I think the only states I've not been to yet. But anyway, people have to rely on all this kind of stuff, right? Now, public transportation, other means of transportation, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, maybe after the first week, they're like, okay, this is a mess. We have 10,000 people out of jobs. And this is what Uber said. I don't know if Uber included that with Lyft. I don't know if Uber said, hey, this is like our fleet and Lyft's fleet, or just our fleet. But you're looking at over 10,000 people without jobs now. You're looking at everyone now not being able to order Lyft and Uber. So what will happen in the future? Will they come back? And I hate to say it, if, let's say, this does get put forward and it's a mess and Uber and Lyft does come back, they're going to have all the power. And then that makes this brings up all these other weird things of, okay, if Lyft and Uber has that much power, and again, I know I'm going a bit down the rabbit hole, but this is what pops into my head, trying to look at everything transparently. If Lyft and Uber has that much power, because they're both separate companies, it would be interesting as a side note when I thought about this, if, let's say, Uber left but Lyft stayed. Well, but anyway, that's obviously not happening. Both are leaving. But if they have this much power, where they can quickly leave, the economy, I'm not saying it's going to be like in shambles. It's not like this is going to be like a horrific thing, but I think it's going to have a bigger impact than most people think. I mean, think about it. Imagine if you can't order a Lyft and Uber anymore. Imagine if you can't drive a Lyft and Uber anymore, right? It's going to have such a big impact. And then if Lyft and Uber comes back, they'll obviously have the power because they're like, hey, we told you guys, we left. Now we're coming back. You got to change something or else we're not. Sorry. That does bring up a quasi-monopoly type vibe to me. of having that much of a stranglehold on a city to be able to easily dictate to leave or not leave. Because think, for Lyft and Uber, it probably takes them seconds, I don't know, maybe not seconds, but like minutes to just deactivate a given GPS grid for both drivers and passengers. It's probably pretty easy for them, and Lyft and Uber, unfortunately, because they're companies they will be fine in terms of like being able to continue on. They don't really need Minneapolis, at least I don't think, right? So that brings up an interesting question of like, that feels like a monopoly to me. And I know this has been talked about a lot as well as, on like places like Reddit. I always kind of read throughout Reddit and other like forums of what drivers are thinking, what passengers are thinking, or even just random people, just to see the general vibe and energy of the way people view different things going on, especially in the ride-sharing world. And people brought up, look, we need to have another one. We need a third ride-sharing company. And I've talked before in other videos how it's very difficult. I think it's very difficult. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty, right, because that could be an extra 20 or 30 minutes on this video. But from an accounting perspective, you need two things to happen at once. You need someone ordering the ride at the same time someone is on the road. And it seems easier. It's way easier said than done. It's easy to say that, but I've used this example of like, so you create a sports drink, take like Prime, like Logan Paul and KSI did, where you can put that on the shelf and 3 months later someone can buy it, right? Just until it expires. With Uber and Lyft and ride sharing, those two things, those two transactions theoretically need to happen exactly at the same time. That's very, very tricky. This is why pretty much no other ride-sharing company has really done well. I know there's a couple. I know was Empower, I think is the name, in the DC area. I think they're in Phoenix too. I'm not sure. I know there's a new one, I think, in Austin. So there's like very individual location-specific ones, but a lot of them have not done well. The amount of companies I've seen that's even contacted me on this channel for me to do like a video for them, do like a brand deal, has been insane, and they've just never done well. I hate to say it, right? So that could be something that could be brought up. Like maybe that could be a third company or fourth, or maybe there's a company that could pop up once Uber and Lyft leaves that kind of fills that ride-sharing hole. I don't think so. I hate to say it. I don't think so. And so I think the only solution to this is for Uber and Lyft to come back. But then you have to ask yourself, what would have to take place for Uber and Lyft to come back? Would they roll this back? Would they find a middle ground? They say, okay, you don't have to pay, and I'm making numbers up. The average driver gets $13 an hour. The minimum wage is $15. Let's meet in the middle and say, okay, $14 an hour. Something like that. I don't know. This is just one of those situations that I think there's so many moving parts, both what's going on right now, but I think also especially for the future. This is going to be a big sign and a big kind of story and a big thing to look back on. I think jumping ahead in 5 years now and looking back in the past, as weird as that is to say, I think this is the kind of story that is going to be a good sign and a good like epitome or example of what does happen when Uber and Lyft does leave an area. And even more than that, what happens when a state or city does something that Uber and Lyft doesn't like. And I think at the end of the day, this is only going to give Uber and Lyft more power, which is something I know a lot of drivers don't want to hear. This is why this is so big. In a month and a half, it's all going down.